Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm comparing the MPC Key 37 to the MPC Key 61. The Key 37 came out about a month ago. Akai sent this unit to me to review, and I figured since I also have a Key 61 in the studio that I would do a direct comparison. Akai has no idea I'm making this video, and this is not sponsored by any means whatsoever, but you should know I was sent a Key 37 last month to review it for the channel. Now, I have a lot of experience with the MPC lineup, and I've used the Key 61 extensively this past year, both myself and my wife, and in the past 4 weeks, I've actually used the Key 37 quite a bit to make some beats. So I'd consider myself a somewhat advanced user when it comes to the MPC ecosystem. I like to use them both in standalone and in the software mode, and I also like to use the sounds that are internal to it. And I also like to pair them with external hardware synthesizers quite often. In fact, it's one of my go-to setups. So in terms of a direct comparison, you would think that the main difference is the keyboards, right? Like 37 keys versus 61 keys. And while yes, that is a difference between the two, it actually goes quite a bit deeper in terms of the hardware. So the Key 37 is technically an MPC 1 Plus with a keyboard added, pitch bend modulation wheel, and foot switch ports added in the back. That's like the main difference between a regular MPC 1 Plus and a Key 37. There is one additional thing that they added with the Key 37, and that's the ability to hook up a USB-B port directly into the Key 37 and then send that to a computer or another MPC. And then the Key 37 will have two USB MIDI ports show up with that cable. No other MPC does that right now, so if you're thinking the Key 61 has everything that the Key 37 has, technically it does not have that feature, which actually is really nice for connecting to computers while in standalone mode. If you want to talk to Ableton Live without hooking up MIDI cables to another audio interface, like you could do it with just one USB cable in the Key 37. I know that might sound confusing, and if it is to you because you're new to the ecosystem, don't worry about it. It's actually not that big of a deal. Again, 61 keys versus 37, and the key bed on both of these guys feels very similar. Like, I would say they're basically the same keyboard. Same level of aftertouch on both of them, and also the pitch bend mod wheel feel pretty similar. Seems like the Key 61 has a slightly higher quality looking pitch bend mod wheel. This has more of a harder rubber, whereas this feels a bit more grippy on the Key 61. And that's actually something that happens across the board here. With the buttons on the Key 37, they're more plasticky, which could mean they might last longer, technically. Whereas the buttons on the Key 61 have this nice rubber soft feel to them. And there's obviously a lot more buttons as well, and I'll get to that in a bit. But in terms of the feeling of the two, the buttons on the Key 37 are more plastic. The keyboard feels exactly the same. The main data entry knob feels the same on both of them. The pads also are basically the same. The pads are basically an MPC 1 pad type of feel, and it's the same thing on the Key 61 and the Key 37. Beyond that though, the Key 61 has a touch strip, and it's actually multifunctional. So when you're in like note repeat mode, if you're doing like eighth notes on a hi-hat, you can actually use the touch strip to rock through the different subdivisions and then latch back. There's also a touch effects type of thing that you can program, that you can adjust like presets in and all that. That's really handy for live performance. I actually wish it was in the Key 37, and I know you can do it via software to a degree, but it's just really nice having a touch strip right here. In fact, the Key 61 definitely feels more like a premium instrument. Key 37 doesn't feel bad by any means and definitely has some good weight and is stable, but the Key 61 feels more comparable to like a flagship model. And technically it is. It has more features, it has more stuff than in comparison to the Key 37. Aside from that USB feature to the computer. So for instance, you can put an SSD drive inside the Key 61. You cannot do that with the Key 37. The Key 37 has an SD port for an SD card. So you can put a regular SD card like this directly into the Key 37, and that's how you're gonna save your data. The thing is, that's pretty much the only way you're gonna save your data. I mean, you could technically hook up a USB 2.0 hard drive into the USB-A port, but it's gonna be a slow drive anyways, so you might as well just use an SD card to begin with. In terms of internal storage, there is 32 gigs of internal storage on the Key 37, and apparently over 22 gig is available for user storage. And on the Key 61, there is 32 gigs of internal storage as well, but 15 gigs of free space for user space. And the reason is there is more samples that come preloaded with the Key 61. I don't want to jump to that topic just yet, but that is the reason why you technically have more user space inside the Key 37. With that said, I don't think you should save projects and samples directly to the internal storage of either MPC, or any MPC for that matter, of the current generation. The reason I say that is it's actually pretty difficult to get stuff off of the drive internally. For instance, if you plug in a USB cable, put it in controller mode, and then plug it into the computer, you do not see the internal drive on the computer. It's not accessible. The only way to get information off of the Key 37 or the Key 61 is to once again use something like an SD card or a USB drive plugged into the USB port, copy the data to that drive, and then plug it into a computer, and then you can transfer back and forth. So that's why I recommend just straight up using an SD card or a USB drive or an SSD drive right away, and don't worry about the internal storage. There's also a lot of reports from people online that if they use the internal storage, it tends to mess up the operating system or mess things up in a way where they just start having these weird bugs that show up. So a lot of people recommend just not using the internal storage. And it stands to reason that any updates or future type of changes that happen to the operating system could affect that internal storage. So something to keep in mind right there. But beyond internal storage, there is the RAM situation, and there is 2 gigs of RAM in the MPC Key 37, 4 gigs in the Key 61, which is once again one of these things that differentiate Pro model versus entry model. Key 37, 2 gigs of RAM, you have less space for your samples loaded into RAM for a particular project. With the Key 61, you have a lot more space with that 4 gig RAM. And I just did a video on this, so I will link it below if you want to check it out. Generally speaking, there's just more features on the Key 61. So you have these transport controls right here, and you can step through the various time. So if you look at the grid, you can see I'm stepping through the 16th notes. If I go timing correct and I put this to quarter notes, you'll see I step through the quarter notes now. I'll put that back to 16 right there. And then these buttons right here shuttle through actual measures. So if I put this up to say 22 measures right there, and pan this out, and then you can see I can jump through the measures like so. So that's handy because it's right above the transport controls, where that is not on the Key 37. And then the locate button right here jumps to like a shortcut system for going to various parts on the timeline. Now you can think of sequences as being either loops or long timelines where you want to write parts like a traditional DAW on a timeline. This locate feature becomes really handy because if you have like an intro, maybe an A section, B section, you know, chorus, that type of thing, or outro, you can have 6 shortcuts to be able to jump through wherever you need to in the timeline, because you can go up to 999 measures on a sequence. Now you might be thinking, does that feature not exist on the Key 37? Well, it does, and all you have to do is tap the bar type of thing right there, click that in, and you have the locate features already. Not exactly like you're missing out, it's just you don't have those type of features directly at your hands right here to be able to work with. And also, if you're new to the MPC ecosystem and you're unaware of this, the software is one-to-one. There really is no difference. There might be some subtle differences, like for instance, there is no Ableton control inside these key versions for some reason. I don't know what's going on with that, but if you have like a regular MPC 1 or Live or X, there is an Ableton control mode in there, but that could change. You know, they're updating the operating system all the time, so there could be some features that come out, and the key versions might get that Ableton control feature here pretty soon. So, but in general, all MPCs that are modern share the same operating system. So if you know the Key 37, you pretty much know how to operate a Key 61, a Live 2, MPC 1, X, XSE, all that stuff. I actually think of it as like a pro and a con. It's a pro in that you can jump to any MPC and be working right away. And it's a con in that every MPC is basically the same thing. Not really much different, right? So to round out the hardware side of things, the other difference, aside from a more premium feel and more buttons on the surface here, is there's a lot more ports on the back. The standout features right there are there's an additional output 3.4 in the back. So you only have one output out of the Key 37. If you want to expand the Key 37, you have to use an audio interface, and you can hook up an audio interface, but the problem is if you go beyond 4 inputs and outputs, then it tends to introduce more clicks and pops. That might change in the future, but if you stay in the default non-32 input and output mode, and you hook up an audio interface that only has 4 in and 4 out, it's usually pretty good. There's also the problem that it adds a slight bit of delay, like 8 milliseconds, maybe 6, depends on the audio interface. But on the Key 61, you automatically have additional output 3.4, and on the inputs, you have preamps. So you don't need to worry about bringing another preamp to hook up a microphone. It's good to go. You have phantom power for your condenser mics, and you have regular preamp gain for dynamic microphones and all that. And you can go DI directly into those inputs as well. So for bass, guitar, you know, acoustic guitar, DI, stuff like that, that works out of the box with the Key 61. For the Key 37, I would recommend getting a preamp if you want to go into the inputs. They're line level inputs, and while you can crank them for certain microphones, you're generally going to get a lot more noise in the signal, which might be something you want. But if you want to do any serious instrument recording production, I would definitely recommend getting some sort of preamp, which again, if you get an audio interface with 4 inputs and 4 outputs, usually there's preamps involved with that. That kind of solves 2 things with 1 purchase. You also have all 8 outputs of the CV gate on the Key 61 available. You do have 8 outputs on the Key 37, but they're stereo pairs, so you have to have a cable that splits out the left-right signal of those CV gate outputs on here. Another big difference is the USB ports. There is 2 USB-A ports and they're USB 3.0 speed. And then there's also a USB 3.0 speed USB-B port that goes to the computer. And the reason this makes a big difference is when you're in controller mode, connecting to an SSD drive that might be installed into the Key 61, the transfer speed is going to be a lot faster. Lastly, there is a network port on the back, so you can plug directly into a network without using the Wi-Fi for a little more stability. Unclocking with various things on the network, you know, through Ableton Link could make a difference. But both of them have Wi-Fi and they can update via Wi-Fi directly in the software. So that rounds out the hardware discussion. We're going to talk software now. And I did say that they're basically the same software, which remains true. The difference with the Key 61 is it comes preloaded with a software package. Specifically, the OPX4, Fabric Collection, Organ, Stage Piano, Stage EP, and Studio Strings. The Key 61, when you buy it, has a license included with those plugins. And if you're wondering, what does the MPC Instrument Collection cost? $500 right now. So if you're thinking you want to get access to some of those instruments right away, you'd have to add $500 on top of the Key 37 to get into the same software package, which means that this $900 purchase suddenly is within reach of the Key 61, which is $1,500 right now. You know, when it first launched, it was more expensive. I don't remember exactly what it was. So if the software interests you at all, you're just $100 away from having a hardware upgrade, essentially. Now, that being said, it goes on sale all the time, so you could get it on sale. Also, you don't have to buy every plugin as well. Maybe you don't want Stage Piano or Stage EP or the Studio Strings. So yeah, if the MPC Instrument Collection really is something that you're interested in, then you might want to just consider going with the Key 61 to begin with. Now, the Key 61 is bigger. Again, the hardware is technically better because you have more options and things, and it does have a slightly more premium feel. But if space economy is an issue, the MPC Key 37 is pretty fantastic. For me, I really like pairing it with a lot of different synthesizer modules specifically. So being able to have the Key 37 as like a centerpiece with a bunch of gear around it is actually really appealing to me. But if you're the type of person that's only going to use the MPC and not really pair it with anything else, I would go with the Key 61, especially if you're more of a keys player to begin with. By the way, shameless plug, if you are planning on picking up any gear, whether it be a Key 61, Key 37, any MPC or synthesizers or cables and all that, if you use our affiliate links below, then it helps out the channel. But I think that about sums it up for this discussion. Those are the general highlights right there between the two. Again, Key 61 is definitely a more premium product, but the Key 37 does the same thing. And I have no problem using either of them. And I use the MPC platform daily. Let me know your thoughts. Drop some comments below. If you got any questions, I will try my best to answer them. Thanks for making it to the end. I do appreciate that. And I'll see you next time for another one. Peace.